chapter 21, unemployment and inflation. So a couple of really important things that we need to talk about when determining how an economy is doing, the health of an economy. If we're seeing trends in these things, it might tell us that something's going to happen or we're recovering from something from an economic perspective. So looking at unemployment, what unemployment looks like in our economy, and inflation. We've talked about inflation a couple times already. What is inflation? Overall increase in prices in an economy. Okay, so overall we see prices go up. Unemployment is a normal thing. Inflation is a normal thing, but keeping track of it, any anomalies, any points of time where those things get out of control or are outside of the normal range tells us a lot about what's going on in an economy. So we're going to start out with unemployment. We all have some point of reference for unemployment. We all have been unemployed, know somebody who's been unemployed, know the impacts that unemployment might have on somebody personally. We're going to look at unemployment from an economic perspective, from a whole economy perspective. As a person, it's a problem, but as an economy, it's an even bigger problem, okay? So the personal costs, let's start out talking about the personal costs. So of course, you don't have any money. You lose your paycheck if you become unemployed. It's a bad thing, right? You can't pay your bills. What do we do with money? We spend it. Spending's good for an economy. Loss of a paycheck, that's the obvious one. But we also see other personal costs. And in economics, we don't just look at the monetary costs. We look at these other costs that maybe it's hard to monetize, but that are really still important. Things like your self-esteem, your identity. For adults, a lot of their identity comes in the form of what their profession is, what they do, what their education is. So that's clearly going to be the problem for the person unemployed. Now, from a bigger picture perspective, on a social level, society level, our economy has fewer goods and services being produced. So this should worry us from an economic perspective, the whole economy. Even if I'm not unemployed, if unemployment gets too high, I say we are underproducing goods and services in our economy, and that's a problem. It's a waste. It's a waste of a resource. So the personal cost plus the social cost, so the cost to the people themselves, plus the cost to the society of those fewer goods and services being produced, is going to give us what we call the true cost of unemployment. So it's important to understand we're talking about monetary costs and non-monetary costs, but all equally as valued, equally as important. Measuring unemployment. So it's really important that we know how to measure unemployment. We're going to talk about how, and then just like I did with GDP, I'm going to tell you what some of the flaws of our unemployment calculations are, because it is a flawed calculation. Unemployment. You did a couple things on your worksheet, right? What is, I think I asked you what was U.S. unemployment? What is that?
3.7%.
What is that?
About 3.7%.
3.7%. That's really low. It's really low. And then I asked you to find it for your home state. Who is a home state who has a significantly different unemployment level than the overall average? Nothing? Nothing in the 2% range, 4% range?
Arizona was in 4.7%.
Arizona, 4.7. Anybody else? Is anybody from Hawaii here? Usually have a really low unemployment rate. Okay? So it varies a little bit from state to state, but overall, we seem to trend around the average. Okay? The unemployment rate, the calculation, the number of unemployed as a percentage of the labor force. So who's the labor force? Well, there are adults who are employed or looking for work. There are people that aren't looking for work. Could they provide labor? Sure, but they're not going to. They don't want to, for whatever reason. So there's a whole category of people who are adults who aren't looking for work or employed. So understanding that we're only talking about that subcategory of people. The labor force participation rate helps us figure out what percentage of our total population is actually participating in the labor force, is actually interested in working. And so that's going to be the labor force divided by the adult population. Only a fraction of those not working are considered in this rate. The only people not working that are considered in the unemployment rate are those people that are actually looking for work. If you're looking for work, you're included in our unemployment rate. Not everybody is unemployed because they can't find a job. They're unemployed because it's a choice thing. Okay? This does not include retirees, students, those who don't want to work, and those working from home. So we have a lot of people that are part of our adult population that are not included in the labor force because they fall into one of these other categories. Okay? Retirees, people who don't have to work, don't want to work, whatever. So the unemployment rate, number of employed as a percentage of the labor force, you've got to find your labor force first. You have to calculate those people who are working or looking for work. That's your labor force. And so it's the number of unemployed divided by the labor force. That's going to give you your unemployment rate. That's how that percentage that you went out on the web and found, that's how that was done. Okay? You should know how to calculate that. So here's just an interesting histogram, I think, that sort of breaks people down, people that aren't working, people in the labor force, people that are unemployed, employed, etc. This whole blue circle here, okay, is the labor force. Those are people that are either employed or hope to be employed and they're looking for work. And then you have the green one over here. This is everybody that's not working. There is only a small overlap here of people that aren't working, that are actively looking for work, actively want to be part of the labor force. And that's actually where those unemployed people are going to come from. Over here, this would be your retirees. These would be students. These would be people, you know, who have enough wealth that they don't have to work, whatever. Okay? All right, unemployment over time. So just a little bit of a history of unemployment. The highest rate of unemployment that we have recorded is during the Great Depression. We recorded at about 25%. Many historians, many economists say it was probably much higher. It was probably closer to 35%, but we've recorded it at 25, so that's what we're going to go with, but it's the highest rate that we've recorded in history. Over the last 3 decades, we've had a couple of big things happen, okay? We had really high unemployment in the early 80s, and by the year 2000, that was down to 4%. And then we were back up to about 10% during the recession. And now you can see we're back at about 4%. Okay? 3.7 or whatever it is you calculate. There are some reasons for this, right? During times when the economy is good and parents are employed, we don't find as many teenagers looking for jobs. Teenagers, when they decide to participate in our labor force, have a high unemployment rate. So if a teenager wants to work and starts looking for work, their chances of being unemployed are much higher. And so that skews the unemployment numbers. So we find when teenagers aren't looking for jobs, that our unemployment goes down because we're not considering them unemployed, and usually it's good economic times, and their parents are working, making a lot of money, and there's not so much of a need for teenagers to work to either provide for themselves or their families. So we find that when teenagers fall off, because times are good and the economy's on a roll, that we seem to have lower unemployment. Went up to 10% as people got laid off during the recession, and teenagers joined the labor force. Because teenagers now had to pay a lot of their own expenses, and parents were laid off, their household incomes went down, and they have a high unemployment rate, which again skews our unemployment higher. So times when unemployment is high, it's sort of two factors that drive that. Usually there's an economic condition where parents don't have work, but then teenagers join the labor force and they have a high unemployment rate, which pulls it up even higher. So we see that there's sort of a double impact when we see unemployment numbers up that high, and it's for those two reasons. Sources of unemployment. This is really important to understand. It is important to know what the 4 sources of unemployment are, because we're going to talk a lot about these in future chapters. And if you don't understand this, you won't understand that. And be able to define them. Not all unemployment is created equal. Not all unemployment is the same from an economic perspective. Okay? If you're the one unemployed, it might feel the same. But when we look at it from an economic perspective, we're able to categorize people into 4 basic categories of unemployment. It's really important to understand. Okay? This would be one of those that I've probably memorized. Okay? This is going to be a good one. There's a lot of multiple choice questions I could ask about this. Or this would be a beautiful sort of fill in the blank or short answer. Okay? The first type of unemployment we're going to talk about is frictional unemployment. Frictional unemployment is normal, it's natural, it always exists. And it is simply the phenomenon of employers and employees taking time to find each other. It takes time to interview for jobs and find the right job. It takes time for employers to interview potential employees, to advertise and interview and find just the right fit. There's a frictional moment there. There's time in which we're just trying to make that match between an employee and an employer. It just takes time. We can't get rid of that type of unemployment in an economy. It just will always be there. It will always exist. Okay? The second type we probably all understand to some extent, and that's going to be seasonal unemployment. There are workers that just work certain seasons. It's when their good or service is performed. It's seasonally. So whether you're a ski instructor, whether you are an agricultural harvester, whatever, right? You run a snowplow. If it is seasonal work, then obviously outside of those seasons, you're not going to have work. A lot of people make all the money they need in their season, and then they can sort of live off that money for the rest of the year. That's not unemployment we can worry about. It's just always going to exist, and so it's normal, it's natural, we can't get rid of it. It'll always be there. Structural is the third type. Structural unemployment happens in a healthy, growing economy with lots of technological innovation and lots of change. And we live in that type of an economy. We live in an economy where people are being replaced by machines. Is that a bad thing? Initially, it seems that way, but overall, it's not a bad thing. We just need to retrain people and put them in another higher value function. Sometimes people become obsolete because of technology, because of changes in their industry. Their job is no longer needed in their geographic area, and they're required to get up and move someplace else to find a job. It just happens. It just happens. So, for example, if a automobile manufacturer shuts down, if a coal mine stops operating, those are very specialized people that have to uproot themselves and go find jobs in their industry someplace else in the country, in the world. So structural unemployment, it's normal, it's natural, you can't get rid of it. This is the unemployment that makes unemployment go from 4 to 10 and back to 4. It's what we call cyclical unemployment. Cyclical unemployment is what we keep our eye on because it has to do with fluctuations in the business cycles, in our economy, when things are good, when things are down, when profits are up, when profits are down. It's this unemployment that we worry about. It's this unemployment that we find makes those numbers fluctuate the way that they do. Okay? Everybody clear? All right. Unemployment can never go to 0. Can't. because we always have these three types of unemployment and we can't get rid of it. So unemployment will never be zero. That can never be the goal. A 3.7, what we have right now, wow, that's as close to fully employed as we're going to see. Okay? All right, other considerations when we think about unemployment, besides what category does it come from? Okay? Which of the four categories? There's other things that we need to consider when we think about unemployment. The first thing is, how long are people staying employed? So those that are employed, how long are they staying employed? Because that can be a huge indicator in economic conditions, in how a recession is moving, whether we're getting out, whether we're getting deeper into a recession, whatever. So long-term unemployment, from sort of a measure, a standard perspective, comes anything greater than 27 weeks would be considered long-term unemployment. During the recession that we had, the 09, 10, 11 recession, we saw people unemployed for years. So long-term unemployment had a totally new gauge, okay? The term full employment is really a condition. It's a condition when we see no cyclical unemployment. When we have frictional, structural, and seasonal, no cyclical unemployment, we say we're fully employed. I would tell you that we're fully employed here in the United States. 3.7, this is kind of as good as it gets. Now, I'll tell you what the flaws in that calculation are here in a minute, but for the most part, that's a pretty good number. It's a decent indicator of economic conditions. Unemployment compensation. Unemployment compensation is the way that the government tries to provide income for people who are unemployed, who have lost their jobs. I say, if you become unemployed, go get yourself some unemployment compensation. It's what it's there for. Your employer is actually responsible for funding the account for unemployment compensation. Essentially, we all have an insurance policy against our employment. And if you should lose your job because of unfair labor practices or because there's a recession and they're downsizing, laying people off, you have the right to go out and collect that compensation. It's there for a reason. Because we know that people need some amount of money to survive, and every penny of that's going to get spent. So even if you are one of those people who's never collected unemployment, great, but unemployment has benefited you. Because there are a lot of people out there spending a lot of money keeping the economy healthy, right? Because they have that money to spend. That is money that gets cycled out of the government and back into the economy, and it just helps make the economy recover a little bit faster, and of course provides basic assistance to some of these people. Does anybody know what unemployment insurance in Arizona is? Or in any state? In Arizona, it's about $255 a week. It's $1,000 a month. If you think about it as a college student, what you spend in a month on rent and food and gas and utilities, you're going to come up to about $1,000 a month if you're lucky, right? If you're working on a budget, you're going to keep it to $1,000. So nobody gets rich off unemployment, right? You might be able to rent a room someplace and cover some bare necessities, but you're not going to get rich. Yep.
I collect unemployment as a student.
That's a great question.
Like if I lost my job and went back to school, would I collect unemployment at the same time?
If you lost your job, like if you were laid off,
Yeah.
I believe you could.
Because that job I have in the summer, that's how they like keep me on and off, because they just take me off after the summer.
Yeah, you should look into it, man. Yep. Now, this is a state-by-state consideration. The state of Arizona has different unemployment compensation than every other state, because every state gets to decide what their unemployment compensation is going to look like. I worked for a company that has a factory here in Flagstaff and a factory in rural western Pennsylvania, like middle of nowhere. And where housing was cheap, everything was cheap, cost cost of living was cheap, and the unemployment compensation was twice as much for those employees if they got laid off than for the employees in Flagstaff, Arizona, where the cost of living was 4 or 5 times as much. It's a state-by-state consideration, right? We made a seasonal product. We had to lay people off every winter. The people in Pennsylvania had a list of people that wanted to be laid off because they could make just as much with unemployment compensation as they could at their minimum wage job. So, like, depending on the state, right, could be a totally different consideration for people whether unemployment is actually going to cover your cost of living or not. But, yep.
How long can you be on unemployment?
That's a great question. That changes depending on economic conditions. During the recession, I think it went to 199 weeks or 100 weeks, which is almost 2 years. I think normally it's a matter of months. I would say 4 to 6 months typically, but the government can change that depending on economic conditions. It's a good question. All right, what's the problem with the unemployment number? Just like GDP, there are flaws here. There are things we can't account for. There are things we're not including. Unemployment numbers do not consider those who are discouraged or are only marginally attached to the workforce. So let's talk about these two parties of people, especially during the recession. You're unemployed for 2 years, you've been looking for a job for 2 years and you can't find anything. At some point, do you just stop looking? Of course you do, right? And that's what we found with a lot of people is they just lost hope, they grew discouraged, they got tired of just being the pavement and trying to find a job with little or no success. And what we found during the recession too is that when people were employed or unemployed for 6 months or a year, employers started to wonder, well, what's wrong with these people? And started to wonder if these people's skill sets began to erode. Like, are you staying up on technology? Are you staying up on programming? Are you staying up on the whatever in your particular job field? So we found that the longer people stayed employed, the worse off they were because they just would grow discouraged and employers would feel like there was something wrong with them. There's almost a stigma attached to it. Those marginally attached to the labor force. This would be somebody who takes odd jobs. This would be somebody who does random things on the side, probably for cash that we can't really track. And so what happens to these people is a lot of times they just fall out of our numbers. They fall out of our labor force numbers. So when we're trying to figure out how many people are in our labor force that don't have jobs, they don't appear anywhere because they've dropped out because they grew discouraged or because they've decided to do work that is marginally attached to the labor force. Just random things that they don't report, low skill set sorts of things. The underemployed. Let's talk about those folks. From a calculation perspective, when we're trying to determine who's unemployed and who's employed, you go out looking for a full-time job and you get a part-time job or even a 20-hour-a-week job, we say, oh, you're employed now. We're going to take you out of the unemployment numbers. And you're like, well, wait, I need a full-time job, but this is all I can find. We don't care. You're employed. We're going to take you out of our unemployment numbers. And so that sort of skews the number too, right? Makes unemployment go down. This up here, these discouraged workers, they make the unemployment number go down. That's problematic, okay? That shows better employment numbers than we really have. Then we have this other one that sort of works in the opposite direction. And that's employment in illegal activities. Employment is employment. But there is absolutely no way for us to capture how much employment is being done in illegal markets. And so these two bring the unemployment number down and make us think that employment is better than we thought. And then this is totally uncaptured information here, which we would hope that we would know, but we'll never know because they're illegal, right? And you can estimate it, but it's really hard to know. So overall, we think unemployment is underestimated. Overall, if we take all of of these things into consideration, we can say, most people would say, that we lose a lot of important data with these categories of people, and unemployment's probably a little higher than the measurement that we currently use to take it. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about inflation. This is kind of a funky chapter in that we talk about unemployment and then we talk about inflation. But they're both really important things to talk about. So inflation, we've already defined it because we've talked about it in previous chapters. The sustained increase in average price level. So most prices, on average, are going up. Some are coming down, some are staying the same, but on average, they're moving up. We find that on average, inflation is 2 to 3% a year in this country. So in this country, 2 to 3%. Let me back up just a minute and talk about unemployment. Your author says that full employment is 4 to 6%. Bless you. It's 4 to 6%. I think it's on the lower end of that. Full employment, it's probably right where we are at 3.7, 4%, something like that. But from your author's perspective, 4 to 6% is full employment. That means we only have those three first types of unemployment. We have no second one. Okay? Just backtracking a little bit. All right, so there are a couple other things that we see when it comes to inflation that we need to talk about. Inflation is normal. It's what we normally see any given year in a healthy growing economy. So in the US, 9 out of 10 years, probably 19 out of 20 years, we see inflation happen. Hyperinflation is extreme inflation. Extreme inflation. We don't see this often, but every once in a while we do. One of my fellow economics professors has money from Zimbabwe, and it's like a 1 trillion currency. I forget what their currency is, but it's a 1 trillion note. So whatever the currency is, it's worth $1 trillion of that currency. Because Zimbabwe went through just massive hyperinflation. Hyperinflation happens usually when a government starts printing money. Why would a government just turn on the printing presses and start printing money and start using it?
When you're in my debt.
Yeah, when they're in trouble, right? They're in trouble. And so they're trying to pay their own bills by printing money, except for when you print money at that sort of a rate, what you do is you drive down the value of the currency that's in circulation. And so it got to the point where if I went to the store to buy a loaf of bread with local currency, they wouldn't accept it. Because the fact is the currency was being printed at such a high rate that the very next day, that paper money was going to be worthless. It was changing overnight, right, the value of that currency. So it came to the point where unless you had gold or silver or some other good to trade, nobody wanted that currency. Again, we rarely see that happen. It's usually when the government is in trouble, trying to fund a war or some other crazy activity, that we see something like that happen. We've never seen it here in the United States. Deflation, we did see this during the recession. We do see it occasionally. It's usually not by a lot. Deflation is a decrease in average price level. Again, this doesn't mean every price is going down. It just means on average prices are going down. And then disinflation. Disinflation is pretty common. It's just a reduction in the rate of inflation. So for example, if inflation 2 years ago was 3% and inflation last year was 2%, they're both still inflation, but because it's going down, it's called disinflation. So it's still inflation, just means the rate or the percentage is headed in the downward direction. But we see that all the time. We see small fluctuations in the inflation rate quite often, but they're small. Okay? All right. There are two basic sources of inflation. Prices go up for two basic reasons. They're not the only two reasons, but they're the only two we're gonna talk about, okay? Because they pretty much cover 90 to 95% of the inflation that you're gonna see. The first type of inflation is called demand pull inflation. Demand pull. So, first thing that should come to mind is demand is changing, which is driving prices. Demand pull. Demand is pulling the price up. So this is inflation resulting from an increase in aggregate demand. Aggregate demand. We're in macroeconomics. So we're not really going to focus on the demand for pizzas or the demand for wheat or the demand. We're going to focus on all demand for everything in the entire economy. That's aggregate demand. It's all. All demand for everything in the whole economy. And that's the demand that we talk about in macroeconomics. And we'll talk more about it. It's very similar to demand in markets, but it's a little bit different, okay? Then the other type is cost push inflation. That's the demand curve, demand pull. Cost push is a shift in the supply curve, okay? So this is inflation stemming from a decrease in aggregate supply. Aggregate supply is going down. Aggregate supply, all supply for everything in the whole economy. If for some reason supply decreases, that would also change the price. Would increase the price. Okay, so just two basic types. We're going to look at some graphs. All right. So here is a graph that looks at an economy's supply and demand. Economy, supply, and demand. All supply, all demand, everything in the entire economy. That's the graph we're going to look at in macroeconomics. That's the graph that we'll keep coming back to over and over again. Instead of particular markets, we're going to look at our economy. Okay? So we have aggregate supply, or all supply for everything in our economy. And then we have aggregate demand, downward sloping. These are just like what we expect them to look like, okay? One's upward sloping, one's downward sloping. So aggregate demand, downward sloping, all demand for everything in the entire economy, brings us to an equilibrium in our economy, which is an equilibrium that tells us what price level goods are selling for in our economy. That brings us back to the indexing that we talked about just for a second at the end of the class period last week. Indexing, trying to figure out how prices are changing over time. Price level is an index. It tells us what type of inflation we're seeing from period to period, usually year to year, could be month to month, etc. Okay? Now, if aggregate demand shifts to the right, why would aggregate demand, why would all demand for everything in the economy shift? Why do demand curves shift? People's incomes go up. We've talked about a lot of this stuff, right? People's incomes go up. People desire more goods, right? Just want more stuff. Whatever it is, right? It's usually because incomes are going up. People have more money to spend. If we see aggregate demand or all demand for the economy increase, it will take us to a new equilibrium. This new equilibrium happens at a higher price level. That indicates prices are going up and we're experiencing inflation. The other type of inflation that we see, so here we are again, we have an economy in equilibrium, but if for some reason we see a decrease in supply, why might we have a decrease in supply of all goods in an entire economy? What kind of things would impact all supply for everything in an economy? Can you think of anything? Tariffs. Beautiful, right? If we can't get goods out of the country, or if it becomes too expensive to try and get goods out of the country, we'll see suppliers pull back on that. Pull back on their supply. Another thing that we see is a lot of times when energy costs go up, suppliers simply can't afford to produce as much. They aren't willing or able to afford as much. So a lot of the reason I think we try and produce the cheapest energy possible at whatever impact to the environment we have to in this particular country. Because we like to keep supply up, we want to keep production happening, and if we can give everybody cheap energy, right, we can keep supply up. It's a resource that suppliers have to buy, and if we can keep it cheap, they'll want to supply more. And so in this case, if for whatever reason, right, and we'll talk more about the reasons, we see a decrease in aggregate supply or all supply in an economy, that will shift the supply curve to the left. That's a decrease in supply, which will take our equilibrium from P to P prime, and that indicates prices are going up, price levels are going up, etc. Any questions about these graphs? Good? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about anticipated and unanticipated inflation. This is really the important thing about the inflation discussion, is how unanticipated inflation is very different than anticipated inflation. That means we do expect, I expect, and now you will too, we expect price levels to go up every year 2 to 3%. That's an expectation. But anybody who's keeping track of the economy, anybody that knows anything about the economy, that's something they're keeping track of. And so when we get something different than we expect, when inflation ends up being higher or lower than we anticipate, it really throws the economy off. Because you and I have made decisions based on expected inflation, or I hope that you will make decisions based on expected inflation from this point forward. So let's talk about the raises you get at work. Because this is where it's really relevant to you personally, okay? Just so that you're clear, when you get a 3% raise at work, that's not a raise. It means you are keeping up with inflation and only keeping up with inflation. So if prices go up 3% a year and you get a 3% raise a year, how has your buying power actually changed? Hasn't. So let's be clear about raises, okay? A lot of times people get a raise and they're like, yay, they gave me a raise. If it's not more than 3%, all they have done is simply allowed you to maintain your buying power. If you don't get a raise, what does that mean for you? You don't get a raise this year, what does it mean?
It's like you're getting a pay cut.
It's like you're getting a pay cut. Because your buying power is going down because prices are typically going up. So when you get your next raise, do a little calculation. Figure out if you actually got a raise or not, okay? Most people don't understand the math. If you get a 5% raise, and we expect inflation to be about 3%, okay, you've increased your buying power a little bit. But just keeping that all in perspective is an important thing. And so let's talk a little bit about unanticipated and anticipated inflation. When we anticipate 3% inflation every year, we can make plans. Businesses can budget, you and I can budget, you and I know what to expect, you and I know what we need our raises to be. We're all informed about the situation. We usually get 3% inflation, you and I can plan accordingly. When we do get 3% inflation, what if inflation is different? What if it's 1%? What if it's 5%? That throws everybody off. You and I all made decisions based on expected inflation that now are totally different. So what unanticipated inflation does is it creates arbitrary winners and losers. It's random. Some people win, some people lose. Okay? And we're going to classify people as buyers or sellers. Okay? When inflation is higher than expected, the loser is the seller and the winner is the buyer. So bear with me. We're talking about you as the seller of labor. If you are talking to your employer about the minimum raise that you need for next year, which is 3%, right, just to maintain your buying power, and you get that 3% raise, and prices go up 5%, after you have signed that piece of paper agreeing to a 3% raise, you do that way before we know what actual price levels are going to change at, in terms of percentage or inflation. So in this case, you're the seller of labor, you lost, right? You lost. Let's look at that from the flip side. If you're the employer, you're the buyer of labor, you can use the same analogy with steel or lumber or anything else that's bought and sold in terms of resources. But your labor is something you can relate to. So let's talk about the person who got to buy your labor at 3% increase. If you're the buyer, you got to pay 3% for that labor, but if there's 5% inflation, chances are you get to increase the price of your good by 5%. But the resource that you bought that's going to help you produce that good, you only had to pay 3% more for that. You won. You have bigger profits than you should because of that unanticipated inflation. So inflation is price going up. Once you lock in your price, it's locked in. You usually end up signing some sort of a contract for resources, whether it's lumber or steel or people, right? You agree to give them a raise, they say, okay, I agree to that, and you move on through the year. If inflation ends up being higher than expected, you lose as the seller of labor and your employer wins. Now let's talk about the opposite scenario. Let's talk about if inflation ends up being 1%. So you expect 3%, so your wage went up 3%, but then we actually get 1%, which means the prices of the things that you buy is only going up 1%. Now you're the winner because your goods didn't go up that much, but your wage did. Yep.
So when it says seller and buyer, you're calling us as consumer sellers and like other.
Yeah. So it's a great question. I'm talking about you in the context of the resource market. So the selling of resources. You're a seller. You sell your labor to companies. Does that make sense? That's great clarification. Okay? We're talking about the resources. And so the prices of your goods, the actual inflation is only 1%. You actually have seen an increase in buying power. For your employer, they had to pay you the 3%, but they were only able to increase the price of the good that they're selling by 1%. This is problematic for them. Okay? They now feel like they're overpaying for you, while they can only increase the price of their good 1%, that creates the opposite scenario. So in this case, if inflation is lower than expected, the loser is the buyer of your labor, and the winner is the seller, that's you, the seller of your labor. Okay? This creates problems when we get something different than anticipated. A lot of times when it comes to unions, does everybody kind of know what a union is? People that sort of band together in similar employment or at the same company, and they try and come up with conditions for employment. A lot of times unions negotiate their wages 5-7 years out into the future. Well, it creates a little bit of a problem because if inflation is higher or lower than expected, right, somebody's not going to be happy. It doesn't allow really for those fluctuations. Okay? Any questions? Okay. All right, inflation and interest rates. What is an interest rate? What's an interest rate?
With a loan, it's like extra money you have to pay back. It's like a fee of borrowing money.
Awesome. It's the fee you pay to borrow money, right? It's also what you earn when you put money in a bank that then you allow people to borrow from you. But the bank figures all the logistics and stuff out. But it's what you earn on your bank accounts, but it's what you have to pay when you borrow money, okay? So interest rates is the dollar amount paid to lenders by borrowers. That's the dollar amount is the interest. The interest rate is the percentage. Interest calculated per year is a percentage of the borrowed amount. Does anybody, I'm sure you all have a checking account, maybe even a savings account someplace. Does anybody know how much you earn on savings accounts typically in this country? It is less than 1%, okay? It's usually 0.5%. So you put money in the bank, in a savings account, and it earns about 0.5%. Then, what the bank pays that to you, and then the bank takes your money and turns around and loans it out to somebody, right? That's how banks make money. Let's do a little calculation here. If you are earning 0.5%, okay, so 0.5, 0.5%, on the money in your savings account, and you're experiencing 3% inflation every year, okay? So the value of your money is going down by 3% every year, your buying power, okay? How much are you earning on the money in your savings account? The value is going up 0.5% every year, and then inflation is bringing it down 3% every year. It's negative. It's negative, okay? Negative 2.5%. Don't put large sums of money in savings accounts. Because the fact is, the longer you let it sit there, what? The less it's worth. The longer you let it sit there, the less it's worth. Your buying power actually decreases because you make so little, and it's so much more than inflation. You gotta do something else with your money. If you need to know what to do with your money, come talk to me. I'll tell you how to get out of the savings account and do something else. Okay? This doesn't make sense. Doesn't make sense. Okay? You want to find something or somewhere to put your money where it's at least making 3%. Right? At least it's maintaining its buying power, or hopefully you're making money and it's making more than 3%. Okay? Pretty basic. Not a lot of people understand this is happening. Okay? All right. The real interest rate that you are earning, we just did the calculation, is the nominal interest rate. That's the physical interest rate that's published that they tell you they're paying you. In this case, it's 0.5%. Minus inflation. Usually the interest rates that you are paid, especially on your checking account, if you're making any money on your checking account at all, but especially your savings accounts, is always going to be nominal. You know, they're going to give it to you, and it's usually going to be annual, which means it's how much you make over a 1-year period of time. And if you subtract out 3% from that every single time, this is the most practical thing you're going to learn from me. I swear, if this is the only thing you walk away with, I'm happy. Okay? If you do that calculation, you will actually know what's happening to the buying power of your money. No more important lesson than that. There are people that have been saving money for 50 years, thinking they're going to retire, throwing money in savings accounts, just to find out what? It's hardly worth anything. It's not worth what they need, okay? Because they make this mistake, that miscalculation. All right. Why is inflation unpopular? prices up. People get really mad that something used to cost $10 2 years ago and now it's $15. People are not happy about that. Inflation's wildly unpopular. The fact is, wages, in many cases, are what drives prices up. And that's happening in Flagstaff, right? The minimum wage situation here. As suppliers have to buy more expensive labor, they have to increase the price, and when they increase the price, it takes the price up for everybody. And so, but the fact is, statistically, that wages usually stay up with inflation. That means that you usually get a 3% or higher wage increase every year, while prices go up an average of 2 to 3%. So we find that, yeah, prices go up, but usually incomes are a huge driver and are going up at usually about the same amount, if not a little better, wages begin to rise. So people view higher incomes as a reward. So when you and I get a raise, even if it's a 3% raise, we think we're getting it because we're a great employee and our employer wants us to live better and have more and have a better standard of living. The fact is, you're just allowing us to maintain our buying power. And so you and I get mad when we get a raise, but then the prices go up at the same rate, and we're like, well, wait a minute, right? People view higher prices as a decrease in standard of living. Higher prices usually means we can buy less, except in our particular economy, we find that higher wages are what results in higher prices. So as the prices are going up, usually our wages are going